If I wanted to lower inflammation as much as humanly possible inside of 30 days, this is what I'd do. This is what I would eat. This is what I would take. This is what I would literally do. So let's jump right into it. The first one's going to make it sound like it's going to be off the wall. But trust me, it's just the baseline and it all comes together and the dots will be connected. At the very base of my diet, I would follow more of a carnivore approach. And I'm not a carnivore diet guy. That's not what I do. But when it comes down to an inflammatory response, we have to look at what we would have had access to and what we would have evolved to have been eating. Now, hear me out on this. I'm not suggesting that everyone goes carnivore. Okay, I understand that there are pros and cons to that. But it's safe to assume that meat is going to be the most benign thing that we could consume. And I mean that because we are understanding more things about different plants all the time. And plants are powerful. Like there's literally such thing as plant medicine, right? Like they can trigger certain inflammatory responses. They can trigger gastric issues. They can also help us, right? So knowing that they can help us or hurt us tells us that they are volatile, not in a good or bad way. But if we wanted to play it safe, the evidence suggests that the closer we get down to a baseline diet, the lower our inflammation is going to be. Does this mean that you do this forever? No. There's a reason why things like the autoimmune paleo diet and why the carnivore diet have been used as ways to be interventions to modulate inflammation. And it's fairly well documented that it can modulate inflammation. There's a lot of case studies with people on this. But if we start looking at the stronger data, we have newer data that really doesn't necessarily support the carnivore diet per se, but when it looks at lower carbohydrate approach as a baseline for reducing inflammation, it makes it a little more clear. This study was published in the Annals of Medicine, and I like this study because it wasn't looking at a ridiculously low carb diet. This just looked at a low fat diet versus a moderately low carb diet with about 20% of energy coming from carbohydrates. Okay, and they put them on us for 6 months, and they measured all kinds of things, and both groups actually lost about the same amount of weight. Okay, so we know from a weight loss perspective, fat loss perspective, about the same. So the total amount of fat that was lost was about the same. Now, if someone lost way more fat, you could say, okay, their inflammation is going to be lower. But what they found here is that the lower carb diet had lower overall glycemic levels. They were able to control their glucose better, but they had significantly lower C-reactive protein, significantly lower IL-1R and IL-6. Their inflammatory markers were dramatically lower, even though they lost about the same amount of weight. Now, this is just one study, but we have other studies that demonstrate that a lower carb approach in this case can be good for inflammation. Does that mean it's the best for muscle building? Does it mean it's the best for fat loss? Not necessarily. But when we're looking at reducing inflammation as much as possible in 30 days, this is what I would do. And within that sort of baseline diet, there's things that I would add. Okay, so just because it's a base of a carnivore doesn't mean we're doing carnivore, right? So fatty fish would be included in this significantly because there was a newer 2024 study that really put a strong nail in the coffin from the inflammation side of things. And what they looked at with this is they found in Nutrition Clinique Journal that people that were damaging their muscles and inflicting inflammatory responses from exercise, which is what you're supposed to do, omega-3s from fatty fish significantly ameliorated the inflammation response after a couple of days. So it didn't crush the inflammation right after the workout to the point they wouldn't recover, but it crushed the inflammation over time so you didn't have the systemic buildup and you were actually able to recover properly. The reason that's important is because exercise induces inflammation. So if I was trying to reduce inflammation as much as possible inside of 30 days, I would have to find a delicate balance of exercising just enough, but also not exercising too much. And these omega-3s layered in with this would have this impact. But now we get into the really interesting part. If I have this baseline anti-inflammatory diet, what would I add to it? You're not going to get polyphenols out of meat. And the evidence is really supportive now with polyphenols and inflammation. And the first one I'll talk about is pomegranates specifically. Pomegranates pack one of the most powerful punches that you can ever get as far as antioxidants and polyphenols are concerned. There are these things in pomegranates called elagitannins, ellagic acid, and urolithins. Now, the interesting thing about some of these components is that you need to have a healthy gut microbiome to utilize them properly. For example, urolithin is what is called a postbiotic. It is deeply ingrained in a pomegranate to the point where it's not going to really have an effect on you unless you have a proper microbiome, which we can talk about, but being on sort of a preemptive lower carb base may help you with this. The elagitannins and the ellagic acid themselves actually inhibit what is called the MAPK pathway and thereby have a monumental impact on inflammation. And this has been documented in research. These polyphenols and these compounds that are in pomegranate are some of the most powerful in the world. And urolithins, like urolithin A, have been demonstrated to help with cellular cleanup and actually help remodel the mitochondria through a process that is called mitophagy. So we've heard of autophagy before. Mitophagy is where the mitochondria is recycling unused or decrepit or disorganized or unfolded and misfolded proteins to make it a stronger mitochondria. It is literally consolidating wasted material into a stronger, more effective material and a stronger, more effective mitochondria. More effective mitochondria means less oxidative stress, which means less DNA damage, which means significantly less damage-associated molecular patterns, which is just ongoing chronic systemic inflammation. I also popped a link down below for the only company that I trust. I've been using it for 4 years now with urolithin A from Timeline Nutrition. This company has managed to take urolithin A, the compound that you can get out of pomegranates, and make it so that it is available to all people, because otherwise only 30 to 40% of the population has the microbiome to be able to utilize in a postbiotic form the urolithin A. So the urolithin A that you get from pomegranate, you can get also from Timeline Nutrition. So I put that link down below. It is a staple for me from a recovery perspective. Not only are there really strong benefits published in JAMA and all kinds of other journals for muscle building, overall muscle health and muscle quality and longevity. So the main focus for me is to potentially modulate inflammation. Having this downstream long-term effect on muscle health and mitochondrial quality, that is a recipe for potentially stronger responses within the muscle and stronger responses in the mitochondria and potentially better inflammatory markers. So for me to recover faster, it is a no-brainer for me. So that link down below saves you 10%. I really do recommend you try it. It's not just me. There's people that are very reputable in the scientific community. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and other people that are in the longevity space are big, very bullish on urolithin A. So again, that link down below for Timeline Nutrition. Blueberries are another huge one. We have chlorogenic acid, we have quercetin, and we have the star of the show, anthocyanins. One of the most powerful, if not the most powerful antioxidant that you can get in fruit, at least in dark berries. The evidence on anthocyanins reducing nuclear factor kappa B, which is the master switch for inflammation, is so strong, I would argue that it's probably the most anti-inflammatory fruit that's out there, with a relatively low sugar content too. But it also is a COX-2 inhibitor. If you've ever taken ibuprofen, that's COX-2 inhibition. Now, not to mention, blueberries also help with endothelial health and ultimately blood flow to the brain. So that's why they're such a brain food. But with neuroinflammation being so prevalent these days, blueberries are very important to stack on top of this base sort of carnivore diet that's not really carnivore. It's more of almost Paul Saladino style in a way. Honey is another big one. You only need a teaspoon or two of this stuff to really get the antimicrobial and antioxidant effect. Okay, because of the components in it, because of its ability to work with hydrogen peroxide and how it interacts in the body, it is not only a potent antioxidant, but has significant anti-inflammatory effects. That's why it's been written in history as something that's a medicinal food for so long. The evidence is very strong with honey, and you don't need much. You don't need to spike your blood glucose super duper high. Now, another one, this is cool because this can go on the meat that you're cooking with this base diet, rosemary. Okay, rosemary has unique properties. Rosmarinic acid is one that I've talked about a lot. That has a lot of cool effects, but there's two other ones that are particularly unique in rosemary. We're talking about carnosic acid and carnosol. Both of these, particularly carnosic acid, increases what's called NRF2. NRF2 is like the body's switch for turning on response to stress from an anti-inflammatory antioxidant perspective. So if there's a stress response, NRF2 is required to start to induce an antioxidant effect on the oxidative stress that comes from the stress itself. So without turning this switch on, you never adapt per se. But carnosol is now being documented quite heavily for its effect on neuroinflammation. So again, a lot of what we're dealing with, from microplastics, things like that in today's day and age, is coming from a neuroinflammation side of things. So adding rosemary, things like that to your meat, perfect. Now let's talk about a couple things to avoid really quick. We'll keep this simple. Okay, things to avoid are things that are away from that baseline diet. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on here. pure sugar, pure refined starches, pure trans fats, unopposed saturated fat. I call it unopposed saturated fat because saturated fat that's coming along with meat, I think you're getting some benefit. It comes from dairy, you're getting some benefit. But even still, I would be a little bit cautious adding lots of dairy in if you're not used to it. So the evidence is now quite strong with dairy showing that the caseins that are in the A1 variety of milk are problematic. Those are potentially inflammatory. We have enough evidence to really support that. And we might be wondering, why isn't there more A2 milk, right? That's the other kind of milk that they have in like Europe, in the US. We're working on it, but it's a process. Okay, people know there's science that suggests this and it supports it. A2 is better from an inflammatory standpoint. Even a lot of the lactose intolerance issues are not even lactose intolerance issues, they're caseinate issues that are coming from the BCM7 in the A1 variety of milk. What this simply means in human terms is if you were trying to reduce inflammation as much as possible, I would try to keep your dairy to a minimum. Unless you can get like kefir or you can get some kind of good quality A2 milk. Now, what I would add into the mix in the way of like simple supplements, curcumin with piperine. Okay, so you got to have that black pepper to increase the bioavailability of the curcumin by up to 2,000%. So hugely important. But there was a new 2024 study on curcumin that is wicked cool. This looked at 13 different articles. It was a huge meta-analysis and it found that curcumin increased superoxide dismutase and glutathione levels, not a little bit, not a lot of it, but a tremendous amount. So we've seen that curcumin is anti-inflammatory for decades. But now we're seeing that it increases the body's inherent antioxidant systems. So really potent. So I would definitely add that in. Magnesium glycinate, I would add in. There was a 2022 study published in Nutrients that looked at 17 different studies, another meta-analysis, showing that magnesium is probably one of the most potent things we could ever consume for modulating inflammation in the body. This particular study in this meta-analysis, 17 different studies, reductions in IL-6, reductions in C-reactive protein, reductions in tumor necrosis factor alpha, and reductions in what's called fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is going to specifically be surrounding cardiovascular inflammation. So if you have lower levels of fibrinogen, you are lowering this potential for excess clotting and helping out with overall cardiac inflammation, which is extremely important because even if you're looking at your C-reactive protein levels, if you get a lab test, you're going to see cardiac CRP. One of the most important things you need to pay attention to is our cardiac inflammation, because that's how the foam cells and the overall cells ultimately form plaque, is through an inflammatory response. And that is what we have to control, that cardiac inflammation. Now, simple things that I would add to lifestyle. Okay, first off, sunlight. People don't think of sunlight as an anti-inflammatory, but it is. That's why there's so much out there surrounding sunlight, vitamin D, and immune system, right? It's very important. One of the biggest things is the simple UVA light from the sun. UVA is going to increase vasodilation, which by itself and endothelial health is going to help with inflammation and blood flow. So that is a very simple one. And just the heat, right? The thermic effect. One of the things that isn't talked about that much is that melatonin is a very strong antioxidant and very strong anti-inflammatory. So much so that it's used in some therapeutic cases. But the more sun exposure, the stronger the melatonin response at night. So the more sun, the more melatonin, the more antioxidant at night. But then we also have the different wavelengths, right? So red light therapy or sunlight in the morning or the evening, getting those 660 to maybe 960, even like realistically more the 660 to 760 nanometer wavelength. That's that red light spectrum that's going to increase what's called cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria, which allows it to produce more ATP. So all the things that we're doing, like polyphenols, everything for ATP function, you can enhance this by getting sun exposure, and particularly early sun exposure, which is nothing new. Huberman talks about it. They all talk about it. It's a very real thing, but it's very important if you're trying to reduce inflammation overall. I would do alternating cold and heat exposure, and not for long periods of time. Sauna is great. I love torturing myself in a sauna sometimes, but the reality is you're doing it for inflammation purposes. You want shorter stints and not extreme heat. Okay, you're going to get prolonged heat exposure, which has an effect on growth hormone, which has an effect on inflammation, and that's all fine and dandy. But now there's some newer evidence on brief cold exposure. So just doing like a sauna and then maybe jumping in a swimming pool or even just a cold shower. It doesn't need to be anything crazy. You don't need to go invest in a crazy expensive cold plunge and have this wild morning routine. What we're starting to see now is there is more T regulatory cell production, which are, just like the name implies, regulatory T cells that help balance the immune system. So from an immune system side of things, when you get ill, you have this influx of like immune cells and this surge of inflammation. Now, this can remain chronic and remain elevated, and if you can control the surge, your body can fight things without going overboard, and that's where the regulatory T cells can come into play. But the other interesting thing is there's been newer research that's documented that cold exposure leads to less toll-like receptor 4 at the spleen level. What this means in human terms is you have a dampened innate immune response, in this particular case, to lipopolysaccharides. This is gobbledygook, but a lot of the inflammation starts in our gut. Okay, so if we take care of our gut, things like bone broth, things like collagen, these are really good for supporting the gut mucosal layer and our overall just epithelial cells that are in the gut. So if we have a leaky gut, then things leak through and we have chronic inflammation in the form of lipopolysaccharide-induced inflammation. This means when your gut is unhealthy, you get more inflammation stemming from the gut. But it seems that cold exposure dampens the innate response and lowers the inflammatory response that comes from a damaged gut. So in the short term, a little cold exposure will reduce the inflammation that comes from a damaged gut while you work to improve your gut health. Now, from an exercise perspective, what I would do during this 30-day period of time is I would do a little bit of resistance training, but I would reel it back. Resistance training is tremendous long-term, but it is relatively inflammatory. If I was trying to reduce my inflammation as much as possible, I would probably reduce my resistance training to like 3 days a week for me. Right? I wouldn't go as overboard. I would just keep tension on the muscle to maintain my size. And I would do a lot more zone 2 cardio. And here's why. It's not the cardiovascular benefit. It has to do with myokines. It has to do with what's secreted out of the muscle. So with this, we look at a study published in Biochimica et Biophysica. And this was cool because they found that the longer that a muscle is going through contractile movement, the more irisin and overall myokines, these things that are secreted out of our muscle, are produced. And when these things are produced, they trigger a cascade of genetic changes in our body that not only help us metabolically, but from an inflammation perspective. So when you have this happening and you're secreting these, your tissues are literally marinating in these exercise-induced molecules that are released. Resistance training does it, all exercise does it, but the studies are showing that the longer that you're going through contractile movement, like riding a bike for an hour or something like that at zone 2, the more secreted. Like it's more about just constant movement. And this is huge because this is going to be one of the strongest contributors to an anti-inflammatory state that you could ever think of. So just to recap everything here really quick, okay, you want to do things that are going to keep you kind of low and slow movement all the time. You want to add curcumin, you want to add things like magnesium, okay? You want to get sunlight, you want to get red light therapy if you can. You want to do brief sauna and cold exposure here and there. It doesn't need to be anything specific, and definitely don't go overboard. You want to link to a more baseline carnivore type diet, more meat focused, high protein, but not over the top. You want to keep your calories in check. You probably want to do some forms of intermittent fasting here and there to keep calories under control. You want to add polyphenols, like you want to get the urolithin A from pomegranates. You want to eat blueberries. You want to consume some honey, and you want to add some rosemary to your food. Of course, you want to avoid the sugar, the trans fats, the excess saturated fats. And lastly, you want to get some fatty fish or at least some omega-3s in. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.